Warm welcome and a big round of applause to Christopher Berry.
That was so nice. Thank you very much, eh? That was very, very nice. Canadians don't like, we're very, very modest, so we don't like a whole bunch of things said about us in advance whatsoever. So I'm gonna take a moment here to try not to be nervous, because when I'm nervous, the talk goes very, very bad for me, and mostly for you, because you have to sit all the way through it. How many, show of hands, how many Canadians are there in the room? Wow, fantastic, incredible. And how many folks are from U.S. border states? Fantastic. So many of you enjoy the superior Olympic coverage that we have. That's fantastic. How many are from the lower 40 United States? Here, fantastic. Love you guys as well. No, I do. I really do. How many are from Europe? Fantastic. Whoa, huge contingent from Europe. How many from Asia Pacific? Fantastic. Super happy to see you. How many from Africa? Not near. 2. Fantastic. Welcome. So happy that you're here. And last but not least, how many from LATAM? Latin America. Fantastic. Super happy that you're here. Okay, thank you so much. That really helps. When I de-anonymize the audience, it really, really, really helps me have a conversation overall. So let's start off with that image. Canadians have a weird thing for building massive, massive statues of weird things along the sides of roads. And I kind of like to think about archaeologists hundreds and hundreds of years from now digging up the artifacts and the remnants of Canadian civilization, and in particular, digging up this massive lobster. I grew up 20 clicks down the street from this massive lobster, and there's a deeper reason why I'm showing it to you. I'll get to that at the end. I grew up on this fault line between Anglophone English culture that's depicted here in red, that gigantic 40,000 dot is the city of Moncton, and Francophone Acadian culture, French culture. It's slightly different than Quebecois. Actually, it's very different from Quebecois culture. That's depicted in blue, or that gigantic 20,000, which is the town of Dieppe. And I grew up on that old Shediac road that's in between the two. And so much of how you saw the world depended on which language you spoke. And as I was growing up, I was taught official bilingualism. I was dumped into French immersion when I was 5 years old with absolutely no preparation, and to this day I continue to torture French in ways that makes native French speakers absolutely hate it. It's this broken functional type of bilingualism that we have in Canada. But it was fantastic because official bilingualism was a bridge that let me go to the other side and understand why those communities thought the way that they did and talked the way that they did. But I was always confused as to why there were two Canadas in the first place. I think social polarization has always been around in Canada. It's always been a force that has pushed us apart in total. So this is a story here about Canada's social fabric and the value that we place on social cohesion within the Dominion of Canada. It's about the natural forces that bring us together, and it's about the natural forces that really drive us apart. It's a story about public media and the way that we've used technology to pull us together. And it's also a story about recommendation systems and how we use that technology overall. So to explain how public media can use recommendation technology, I need to tell you a bit about the idea of Canada in the first place, and why I think that it's an idea that's really worth spreading and defending. So I think this is what most people think of when you think of Canada. Most of the people that aren't Canadians, about 90% of you probably think of Canada in these terms. It's absolutely beautiful, eh? It's absolutely beautiful. How many have been there? How many have been here? Yeah, it's gorgeous when you're actually there. And I see beauty too. But as a Canadian, I also see black bears, typhus, and an incredible amount of hypothermia. This land is brutal. This land can kill you. This land actively still kills people on a regular basis. It is a massive country. It is 1 billion hectares worth of rock and mosquitoes and beautiful, unbelievable lakes, massive amounts of water. We've always had so much geography. When this country was founded, there were only 3.5 million Canadians in 1867. And the people that we had before, they weren't always getting along in the first place. The Lower Canadian Rebellion of 1837 was unbelievably bloody. It pitted Catholic Francophones against English Anglophones, and they killed each other in very, very large numbers. It was really, really quite brutal, and it happened a little bit earlier than all the other trouble that began to happen around the world. And it was in this backdrop that these guys grew up in. And when you think about the world of the 1850s and the 1860s, it's kind of amazing that they even met, that they even tried to work out differences. And there were very, very, very severe differences in Canada. I mean, you had roughly equal numbers in the Canadas of Catholics and Protestants living side by side. And in most other countries, that was not working out particularly well. Italian unification was going very, very badly at the time. It was incredibly bloody. There was not exactly social harmony going on in France in 1850. And just south of the border, you had Yankees killing Dixies in very, very large numbers. So peace, tolerance, our founding principles of peace, order, and good government were not particularly popular at the time. But yet, these gentlemen got together. I'm lingering on this slide because there's a lot going on. You might notice a few things. That striking gentleman that's sitting in the middle, right, framed in the middle, right underneath that gigantic window, that's Sir John A. Macdonald. He drank a lot of whiskey, an incredible amount of whiskey. And it's kind of convenient that Canada came together right about the time that he became the Prime Minister. It's kind of neat how that worked out, I think. You might notice the windows. Those are absolutely gorgeous. That's a founding myth. Those windows never existed. You might also notice how unbelievably diverse that set is. Like, holy cow. There's, out of these 36 men, 32 of them are Anglophone English Protestants. 2 of them actually have the same name. There are 2 John Hamilton Greys that are there. And we actually label them. There's John Hamilton Grey, New Brunswick, and John Hamilton Grey, Prince Edward Island. And that's how they're forever remembered, actually. There's not a single woman. There's not a single First Native representative. There's not a single Acadian that was represented. There were just 4 Catholic Quebec Francophones that were invited. And as a direct result, many of those founding fathers that continued on in government made some pretty big mistakes. The Indian Act of 1876 is a particularly egregious example of a law that should not have been written that way. There were 100,000 First Nations people in the Canadas. 3.5 million at the round of founding of Anglophones and Francophones in the country. And the way that we invited Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta into Confederation as being less than equals is something else that we're still working out of our national fabric. When I think about all the challenges that laid ahead of them, a world that was not really all that conducive to the ideas of peace, order, and good government, and just thinking about 3.5 million people trying to capitalize a railroad to bind the country from east to west, I think it's pretty impressive that they managed to do it, and that the country even managed to hold together in the first place. And to this day, we continue to try to make it better, learning from our mistakes and building up more and more tolerance over time. And it turns out that this idea of Canada was somewhat good, and you can tell that it was a good idea because it spread. You had 4 innovative provinces right from the get-go. You had New Brunswick, which many people don't associate with innovation, but it was very innovative that they came. Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario. We promised a railroad to this province here that you're in, British Columbia, and they ended up joining by way of a legislative vote in 1871. We promised a bridge to Prince Edward Island. They joined in 1873. I told you about the 3 prairie provinces. And then Newfoundland actually voted willingly through a referendum to come join us in 1949. Good ideas tend to spread, and the idea of Canada did spread. Now, the forces that have pulled us apart have really always been there. This physical geography makes it very hard to hold a country together when you look at it. The Maritimes out east is all influenced by glaciers. It's really hard to put those things together. The prairie provinces are economically oriented north to south, and there's this massive, beautiful set of mountains north to south that separate Vancouver and Victoria out from the rest of the country. You couldn't ask for a harder geography to bind a country together overall. And yet it was observed that in the 1920s, the railroads were putting radio stations in all along the rails. And somebody thought that it would be a pretty good idea if Canada had a national broadcaster to bring the country together culturally. And that's how our first public broadcaster, and the current one that I work for, CBC-Radio-Canada, came together. We peppered this entire country with a huge number of radio towers, and then we later added television all the way across, and that's our current surface map overall. It's a massive, massive, massive country to service, and most Canadians, I think it's on the order of 99.9%, by Broadcast Act, receive a signal from the CBC. And it turns out that this also caused our common culture to diffuse, and this was pretty effective. From Whitehorse to Iqaluit, St. John's to Victoria, our shared idea of Canada has diffused. You might notice some things when you were in Canada. Did you notice how often we said sorry but didn't seem to mean it? Passive aggressiveness is actually a Canadian invention. Have you ever tried to negotiate with a Canadian? It's the reason why you're irritated, the reason why we're trying to ferret out information about why you win, is because if we can't figure out what's in it for you, then we don't think that the deal is actually going to last. So it's not that we're trying to screw you, we're actually trying to create a lasting relationship, and then possibly screw you. We also pronounce the letter O properly here. In progress and in roof. That's for my friends from the lower 40 of the United States. Social cohesion through a national identity is great because it facilitates trade, it facilitates collective security. It means that we don't have to spend massive amounts of money on police forces or military forces in an effort to keep the population in line. There's all sorts of very, very good things that happen when you have strong social cohesion within a society. And for a very, very long time, this worked. This really worked. And then there was a night in 1995 when it seemed like it wasn't going to work anymore. Now, there's a lot that's going on in this image. For the Canadians in the room, do you remember this night? Show of hands, who remembers this night? Right. So I'm gonna break it down. The windows in the background, you recognize those, right? So typically when you see a Confederation window, when you see a Charlottetown window, bad stuff is happening. Very bad stuff is happening. It has to do with the Constitution or the very granular nature of the country. It's on CBC television. You can see the gem there. You see how worried he is? A younger Peter Mansbridge, who is our lead anchor for nearly 25 years. He looks very worried. He normally doesn't look that worried. 0.1% of the polls are open. So it's very, very early in terms of how much vote is coming in. And you see the bar chart there. 60.2% yes, 39.8% no. A vote for yes meant don't let historical revisionism come in. A vote for yes meant the country was breaking apart. That was it. We wouldn't have a Canada. Quebec would separate, and that would be it. And in the early part of the night, from about 8 p.m. Eastern until about 9 p.m., I can remember my parents saying, well, that's it. The entire country's done. That's it. It was nice while it ran, nice while it lasted. And I was a teenager, and I was so mad because I didn't want to become British again. I was Canadian. I spoke French terribly. I didn't want to be British. So about 20 minutes later, at about 9:20, the island of Montreal, all those votes came in, and we managed to hold the country together just barely. 50.58%, the slimmest of margins, and by and large, that island there, it's blown up there on the right, that southwestern area has a huge amount of Anglophones and brand new Canadians that live there, and just barely by the slimmest of margins, Canada held together. And it's hard to overstate the impact that this had on all of us. We nearly lost something that we had been taking for granted for a long time. It had a massive impact on things that were to come. A government got ensnared in a scandal immediately after this election result, which led to a federal election that happened in 2004, which caused another election in 2006, which led to another election in 2008, which led to another election in 2011. This continued to roil for a long period of time. It also affected my education in a big way. I just wanted to do public policy. I didn't want to learn how to break the country apart using different areas of the British North America Act to bust the country apart. But one way or another, I was going to be taught that skill set because it was deemed to be very important and enforced upon me. So it really, really hurt elites. A lot of Canadians began to forget about it. And I can only imagine how this debate would have gone, how this vote would have gone if the internet had been around at the time. And the internet did come around. In 1995, broadband penetration really took off in Canada. We really took to it. We love our networking technologies. And as did smartphone penetration. Smartphone penetration really took off. We like being connected within the Dominion of Canada because the spaces are so massive from each other. And how do I move on to this? This would become severely challenged. All of this would become very, very, very severely challenged by around 2010. And in order to understand why, I need to show some math. And typically this, for civilians, the next slide contains a jump scare for them, but I think for this room, it's not as much of a jump scare for you. All right. There's the natural, you handled it great. You've been subjected to this natural law your entire life. When you learned the alphabet or your ideograph system, whichever, you were subjected to this natural law. When you wanted and received your first action figure or toy, you were subjected to this natural law. When you decided to come and stick around for this keynote, you were subjected to this natural law. It's called Bass Diffusion, and it's incredibly well tested. Originally, it was used to explain how air conditioners moved through a neighborhood, actually. It really was like through a suburb. And it was observed that, that neighbors would learn from each other over their fences that they wanted an air conditioner. They wouldn't learn from the weird neighbors who lived across the street. And so, based off that insight, a whole bunch of math around learning began to come together. Adoption starts off slow, it accelerates, and then it plateaus once saturation is reached. And to understand why this sometimes happens very, very quickly and why this sometimes happens very, very, very slowly, I need to explain two coefficients, P and Q. P is the coefficient of innovation, and the coefficient of imitation that wants to be very, very tight up there up against the P. Is the other coefficient. One of the neat ways that I like to remember is that P comes before Q, and P is the superior letter, and Q is just a cheap copy of it. It's just copied overall. The coefficient P recognizes the contribution of people that like to try brand new technologies before they've been really tested all the way. They like novelty. They may have purchased, who here's first smartphone was a BlackBerry? Does anybody remember BlackBerry? Yeah, that's, If it was, you may have purchased the BlackBerry Pearl, which featured a little pearl item, a little pearl thing that when you put it into your pocket, a whole bunch of fabric and other detritus from your body would accumulate, rendering the ball useless, and as a result, the entire phone became useless. And Q, the people that let you do that, wait for the technology to become better and then learn that the technology is actually safe to use. And these two coefficients were relatively stable for a good period of time. The number of innovators starts off relatively high and falls down. The number of imitators, they stay on the sidelines and then they come on in a big way, and then eventually the laggards come on stream. And this is how, in general, products and ideas diffuse through society. And then this guy happened. The coefficients of P and Q were relatively stable for 50 years because outdoor advertising, radio, television, I'm not supposed to call it junk mail, but junk mail, direct mail was all very effective at spreading out ideas. And then suddenly, P increased and Q increased. And I can't put it entirely on this guy's plate for that. For him to have been effective at amassing so many billions, he needed to have cloud infrastructure in place. He needed to have broadband in place. He needed to have smartphones in place. He didn't invent all those things. But he can be credited with using certain technologies to shelter your attention away from that person in your social network that is continuously posting pictures nonstop and is really mad that you're not seeing everything that they're posting, but if you did see everything that they were posting, you would disengage from the platform. That was a key insight. That was a key piece of technology that he can overall take credit for in the end. Here you can see P and Q at work, Canada versus the United States. I assure you, you can actually use Google Trends for this, to not just look at products like the effect of Facebook on Facebook adoption. You can look at this for different types of products, like air conditioners or cars. You can see in Canada that we had a stronger P in the upfront. We were our innovators were very fast to adopt, and then we had a slower Q, whereas in a lower Q, whereas in the United States, Facebook adoption had a lower P and then a much higher Q afterwards. And these vary based off of societies overall. And the other proof point of that, CBC-Radio-Canada started tracking social networking usage in 2006, and when we caught it was at 18%. It accelerated up and then slowed off onto the top. Canadians absolutely love social networking technology overall. So I joined the first group of data scientists around 2010 in exploring the impact of P and Q. Sinan Errol, Sean Taylor, Dylan Walker, they executed some of the first randomized trials on contagion through these networks at the time. And most of the industry and most of the literature was focused on innovators. It was very P coefficient oriented. And a bunch of us, including Jason, who I work with, we were focused on Q. It was far more interesting to think about the people who were most susceptible, because we're seeing the biggest pops in Q. When you think about the way that this social networking technology works, the people who are looking for the social validation cycles really value seeing other people using and adopting brand new ideas. And some people are just naturally more susceptible to social reinforcement cycles. It's an inherent property of human beings in the end, that there's a heterogeneity that's involved there. We've also long known that when you add information to a network, it polarizes. This is one of my favorite stories. I love this. It's a non-Facebook example. A bunch of researchers in Italy were focused on an Italian social network. And this social network had a very neat property to it that when you visited somebody's profile page, it left a little piece of recognition that you had visited it. These researchers had programmed a bot because they were doing some scraping with permission of the platform. And somehow, a rumor got out that it was a bot. So one group of people were convinced that it was a bot, and they formed they formed their own clique, and then they began trading insults and negative valence with a group of people that didn't think that it was a bot. So people tend to polarize over the dumbest, weirdest things. And in general, it just feels so unbelievably good to get that hit of dopamine that only social validation and righteousness can provide, doesn't it? And this is the obligatory Margaret Atwood slide that you have to show in Canada. I think these social feedback loops are really, really insidious. They've taken on a life of their own, because when you think about it, you don't want to believe in yourself that you're sheeple. You don't want to believe that it's entirely that you've been persuaded by other people by way of social learning that you've been subjected to it. You don't want to believe that you're susceptible. You want to believe that you're a strong, independent person that made up your mind completely independent of anything. And I think that this dynamic is as locked in as the QWERTY keyboard format is. I think it's deep lock-in, that when you challenge social validation cycles, when you try to dampen them off, once an expectation has been formed around them, people get really, really mad about it. And we've been seeing that. We've been seeing a lot of that. Now, these social laws have become really as predictable as the tides, quite frankly. And if they're as predictable as the tides, they can be used. And they can be used to erode overall social cohesion in general. And in many instances, I think about to whose advantage would it be if Canadians weren't getting along? Because in general, when Canadians are at each other's throats, we're really at our worst, like we were in 1837 and like we were in 1995. Now, there's many broadcasters and publishers in the world. Where's BBC at? There's been a BBC guy that's been around a lot. There's at least 3 public broadcasters that are here. Oh, there we go. So there's loads, like the BBC. The BBC is fantastic at exporting their culture abroad because you've been doing it for 400 years? What? No. I mean, that's a good thing. I mean, France Television has been exporting their culture abroad as well, and CCTV is super good at exporting their culture abroad overall. I think that's fantastic because all of these public broadcasters, by virtue of broadcasting, gives you a different perspective that you know reliably where they're coming from, right? And if you understand where they're coming from, you can form a much more intelligent opinion about what's going on overall. So just by virtue of continuing to broadcast, public broadcasters add tremendously to the collective enlightenment of the societies and enrich other societies as well. I think that's absolutely fantastic. So just by virtue of broadcasting. Now, why doesn't Canada do that? Why doesn't the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation do that? Well, in part, we haven't even filled up our own country yet. We have about 6 million Canadians that are spread over 1 billion hectares of land. And when you're that far away from other people, it is alienating. The geography itself alienates you from other communities. If you're out in the hinterland and you don't feel as though people in Toronto care about you, or you don't feel as though people in Montreal or Vancouver care about you, they really, really get angry. And it's one of those forces that we try to cause empathy with other Canadians to actually care about all those Canadians that are living and spread out across such a massive, massive geography. On the other side, over 81% of Canadians live in a city. 12.5 million Canadians live in just 3 cities. What 3 cities do you think that 12.5 million Canadians live in? You can just shout them out. Toronto, center of the universe. Yes, Toronto. Montreal. And you're presently in the third one. Isn't it weird how we have 1 billion hectares and yet we all crowd in to like less than 0.5% of the country? Like the real estate here in Vancouver is insane. It's like a pretty open country. Now, these are globalized cities in an international economy. They're open. Facebook, Amazon, I know that you're here. Apple, Netflix, Google, we call them FANG, they are very competitive in these markets in particular. There's relatively okay broadband in these markets, so they're exposed full on to other cultures in a globalized way. And I think because there's so much more to see and do, it's in this landscape that public broadcasting really, really has the biggest challenge ahead of us. So let's talk about cohesion then. Now, because it's actually complicated. Now, we've held on to commenting at CBC. We've held on, and it's not a free-for-all. It's not a free speech zone. Our national values are peace, order, and good government. And there are certain types of speech that are not conducive to peace, order, and good government, right? You can't make threats, right? You can't advocate for terrorism. You can't advocate for the mass murder of a specific particular group. And there's also a recognition that free speech for some means effectively no speech for other people. So we've invested heavily in scaling commenting at the CBC and making it more safe for more people to participate. Now, that doesn't mean that when you go there, you're going to have your latent bias reinforced at you. You're actually going to have some pretty hard things to read if you choose to read and engage in the comments overall. But it's worth keeping that square open, and including in the case of cbc.ca/New Brunswick. Now, New Brunswick has a very, very interesting history when it comes to media concentration and ownership in the province. Very, very interesting history. So as a result, CBC tends to be one of those most independent places where people go to read comments and see news. And it's also a place where some Anglophones and some Francophones trade some very, very, very hurtful barbs towards each other. And I'm not saying that machine intelligence and any of the brand new technologies that we've seen are going to be able to completely eliminate all of the most esoteric, hurtful types of racism that are specific to southeastern New Brunswick, but at least it holds, we're trying, and at least it holds the public square open. Now, when you ask the why does that occur? Why are those cleavages there? The literature on social cohesion is unbelievably messy. It's incredibly, incredibly messy. The obligatory Jensen 1998, Mapping Social Cohesion, which coincidentally was published in 1998 as a direct result of the referendum, has had an impact. And it's not the case that there's any sort of cohesion within the social cohesion literature at all. The economic stuff is very, very interesting because in general, we've observed in Canada that when people are well fed, they don't eat each other. So it's very important that there's economic growth in aggregate, so that's a good thing, and we have several institutions that are dedicated to that. For CBC-Radio-Canada, we focus on that upper left-hand area, that social network, participation, trust, and mutual tolerance area in terms of the definition. So I acknowledge that there are many, many definitions of social cohesion. In the context of public media, I'm only going to focus on that upper left-hand side. So this is the data that I can talk about, and it's open. It comes from the Canadian Elections Study. And inside the CES, there are two questions, actually. How do you feel about the following countries and groups? And in the web version, there's a slider with any number from 0 to 100. 0 means you really dislike the country or group, and 100 means you really like, in all caps, the country or group. And then there's the second one, pause, is how do you feel about the following countries and groups? Slide the slider to any number from 0 to 100. And you see the battery there. There's the traditional, how do you like Canada? How do you like the United States? How do you like Quebec? How do you like politicians? And then it goes into all sorts of additional groups overall. So I combined the two scores together, and you can see on average on the feeling thermometer how Canadians feel about these various groups. And it provides a window as to why we see the phenomenon that we see in the comments section, being right there. So we have a traditional cleavage that I led off with. Anglophones on the Y, Francophones on the X. You can note the positive skews. It's actually much better news that there's so much density there in the upper right-hand quadrant, right? A lot of people really like Anglophones and Francophones, scoring at 100 out of 100. Here's another cleavage. Feminists on the Y-axis, LGBT plus on the X-axis. You note those side skews. So again, it's pretty good news overall. And then we have some tougher cleavages to work on in the country. Muslims on the Y-axis, immigrants on the X-axis. There's that bulge around 50-50, and there's a disconcerting island there around 0-0. And that manifests itself every single day on the comment section, and it eats away at our social cohesion. Now, this is one measure. This is one way of looking at social cohesion and operationalizing the concept overall. There are many other ways, and I'd love to talk to many of you about how to operationalize it in different ways. But we can unmask it, and we can understand the degree of cohesion that we have within the society overall. So it's these forces that CBC-Radio-Canada is up against. And we're driven by social cohesion and common good. I happen to believe that the idea of Canada is a pretty good idea on the whole. So how are we fighting for social cohesion? Well, we have a pretty flat org structure at the CBC, as you can tell. Pretty flat org chart. We're investing in machine intelligence and in machine learning and in deep learning in particular and in RecSys in particular. We are incredibly inspired and thankful for, in particular, this paper. Are the authors in the room today of this particular one? Thank you very much, Thank you very much. This is a fantastic paper. And because I work for you in public media, we can afford to run algorithms like this. We can actually afford to try. We use a lot of gated recurrent units as part of our work, inspired by that. It's one tool in the overall arsenal that we have to try to bring people together and to have more empathy with each other overall. These recommendations are session-based. They're rooted in your behavior. And these recommendations are for me, actually, and they get it quite right very often. I have a latent interest in Newfoundland and Labrador and on stories about Tim Hortons quite a bit, but that's because I'm Canadian overall. And I'm particularly excited about Fat Rec tomorrow on the fairness and accountability and transparency for Canadians in terms of explaining how this technology is being used to further our cohesion and our journey together overall. So this bridge, by the way, was the one that was promised to Prince Edward Island in 1873, and it was finally built in 1995. So it was, a true success story that it was built overall, but we built it. Public media is really about building bridges in the end. There's the social infrastructure of holding people together, especially against huge centrifugal forces within, centripetal forces within Canada. Just as investments into official bilingualism has held New Brunswick together peacefully, we believe that investments into public media and into RecSys technology and into machine learning technology can hold us together within Canada overall. Some questions perhaps for the flight home, and I'm not telling you what to think or how to think or anything along those lines, but this is what I'm thinking about. Your context might vary. Your country might vary. Should RecSys be even used to help social cohesion form? In Canada, it's a specific case because we are so diverse and we are so scattered over such a massive area. So we can use every single technology we can get our hands on in order to hold it together. But your context might be different. There's also this inherent relationship between content that polarizes and content that unites. I think it's really hard to hate people that you empathize with And so much of the content that CBC produces is about Canadians telling stories to other Canadians and having all Canadians see what other Canadians are going through. However, there is news that generates polarization because there are facts that generate polarization. What's the relationship between those things? Both intra-session, using session-based RecSys, and inter-session. And perhaps more curiously, can RecSys cause empathetic attitudes to become contagious? Can we ride the coefficients of P and Q to stronger national unity and use technology to amp it up, much the same way that we used radio and television to do so? And so this is one of those core takeaways. How can public media really help? It's by building bridges, and it comes down to the folks in this room to cross over. For the Canadians to engage more with your public broadcaster and with other Canadians, and in your respective societies, how you choose to build your technology and how you choose to think about how your technology impacts a social good overall. It's by way of crossing over. So I led with this lobster. Why did I lead with a lobster? I was about 5 years old when I got my first lobster, right about the same time that I was being forced to learn French. And it was a massive, red, hot... I love the fact that people are taking pictures of the gigantic lobster. That is just... that's amazing. It was a big, red, hot, steaming insectoid mess. And I was a kid. I have no idea how to eat a lobster. So, how did I learn to eat a lobster? It was by way of taking it apart one section at a time. You break a lobster down. There's a different skill set involved in each part of the lobster. The claws demand a different set of tools. The tail demands a different set of tools. You can even learn how to open up the tail like a book in the end. It's very rewarding when you do. And I think of social cohesion and recommendation systems as being at the intersection, a similar way of like eating a lobster. There's a way of breaking it apart, and yes, it's red, and it's hot, and it's a nasty insectoid mess, but it can be done overall. And with that, I want to thank you very, very much. Thank the organizers very, very much. Thank you so much, Michael and Sol, and to wish you all safe travels. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So questions?
I have a question. Hi.
Hi.
So there's a recent trend, well, I don't know how recent it is, maybe it's been going for quite a while, that of the spread of misinformation, fake news. Do you think that, does fake news bring around cohesion, or does it polarize people?
Okay, so in general, I'm going to be careful with the way that I say, because one person's fake news is another person's truth, right? So it would seem as though groups of people have formed social validation loops around facts that appear, or myths that appear to be awfully convenient for their context. So it's similar. I told you about our myth, about Confederation windows. I'm sure, was anybody offended when I said that the Confederation windows weren't real? Were there any Canadians that didn't like that? Any architects in the office? But sometimes there's not. I think that it's related to the natural polarity that when you drop information into a network, it's going to explode. And I think that some people, right? I think one of the shocks was that marketing was effective. It was like marketing was always effective, but they weren't aware that it was effective on them. So I think that it has a lot to do with how some groups of people have mobilized the insight that there are some people that are susceptible, and that it becomes very, very, very hard to get them off of that track overall. So I think it's related to both state, non-state, and other actors overall. Hello.
Hi. Great talk. I think these are topics that are really important for our community to look into. The question that I have is philosophical, and I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to ask it, but I'm going to try. I'm wondering, so I'm a foreign person living in the US, and I feel like a lot of US people look at Canada as this wonderful Smurf village where everyone's happy. And so I work a lot with people who are kind of radical activists, mostly on the left, and I hear a lot of arguments from those people against social cohesion, with the idea that social cohesion can in some ways be an impediment against distributive justice. If your country is not doing great, social cohesion can actually impede the realization of uncomfortable truths. And so how do you reconcile social cohesion with that problem?
Sure. So the way that I do it in the Canadian context is, okay, there is literally no way to cause uniformity within a country as vast as Canada. So if you expect everybody to live according to your way of living and you want to rally the state to cause people to live in that way, you are going to have a brutally bad time with it. It is just not economically or socially or physically possible to cause. So that's why I ask, should RecSys be used in your context to cause social cohesion? In Canada, the forces that are pulling us apart are or often, they feel like they're way greater than the forces that pull us together. So for me, I think it's a no-brainer that we should try. We should at least try to use the technology to bring us together. In other contexts where there's way too much cohesion in its uniformity, that it actually it drowns in individual initiative, it might not be appropriate in that context. So I think, I'm so sorry to say this, I think it depends. Depends.
That's fair.
Boo, I feel bad even for saying that. I'm sorry.
Hello?
And actually, I meant sorry. I don't mean that as a non-sorry. Right, yeah. Howdy.
Hi, this is Xavier from Curai. So I really love your talk, but it also made me think about more questions rather than answers. So here's a question for you. So what is your thought on filter bubbles and how they impact or they influence social cohesion? There was a paper published just 3 weeks ago that was saying that exposing people to opposing views actually helped sort of create polarization, so rather than bring them together. So is the solution to social cohesion actually filter bubbles? Is it to keep people happy in their own little bubble and not expose it too much to, what others think? Or is it the other way around? It's like we just need to get people to understand each other and empathize, even if that creates frustration. But that seems not to help. So how do we deal with that?
I wonder what kind of tools people would like to have to be able to manage their own intelligence. No, I'm serious. I mean, how would we want to be treated? I mean, sometimes when you're in a lizard brain mode, when you're raging very, very hard, you're not really receptive to hearing certain brand new ideas, right? So, and sometimes you're feeling far more deliberative, so you're in a state to actually want to receive those. So, as opposed to it being an exogenous manipulation component, I wonder what kind of tools and instrumentation we could give people to manage their own intelligence as they're moving through their day or through their experience overall. So that felt like I answered directly and did not dodge. It feels like I answered directly.
Kind of. Thank you.
Thank you. Howdy.
Hi, Ben Fields from the BBC.
No, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
please broadcast your culture.
Well, I mean, that's another point. It's not my culture. I just live there. But you might note the accent. I did wonder, actually, when you're talking about sort of social cohesion from a public broadcasting standpoint, does it sort of necessitate trade-offs for the organization to focus in that direction? Because you don't sort of operate in a place where there's one broadcaster that just gets to do whatever they like and focus on whatever they like. So if you're choosing to focus on content in a particular way, does it mean that you might give up some of your market? Is that okay? Does that self-defeat in the end if some other broadcaster is focusing on clicks and you choose to present a sort of more nuanced picture? What are you giving up? And how do you maybe navigate that space?
Yeah, so a private broadcaster needs to focus on a segment, and they need to produce content that segment really, really likes. And there's no shortage. We have radio stations in Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal that are dedicated to telling people in cars who are traffic that they're not traffic, which is an unbelievably profitable thing to say to those people, right? We have loads of narrow private broadcasters that fill out that niche absolutely beautifully, right? I think. For the public broadcaster for Canada, I don't know if this is the same for you. I have a saying. We have 14 firefighters per 1,000 people. We have 22 doctors per 1,000, 3 people in the military per 1,000. Canada has 997 media executives per 1,000 people in the population. That's the number of Canadians that know how to run the CBC better than the people that actually work at the CBC. Which is fantastic. Everybody feels ownership, and a lot of people feel very, very angry when they don't see their version of Canada reflected back at them in the grid. So we have this challenge where we have to reflect the entire diversity of the country back at folks. We actually have to hit all 4 quadrants, and we have to be male, female, 35 under, 35 over, to appeal to the entire mass. So long as some quadrants of society are seeing themselves effectively reflected, and in particular groups of people in Canada that are not economically large enough, viable enough yet to be able to have their own private, narrow broadcaster, we need to keep on reflecting the overall total. And if that means that we lose portions of the population, we need to work harder on the overall cohesion, because if we win them over, then everybody's going to win together. So I'm sorry, that was a longer answer, but I think that's the way that we're going to go.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Howdy.
Omar from Microsoft. Thank you very much for the great talk. It's a question more related to the recommendation systems. So when you're trying to use recommendation systems to achieve better or more social cohesion, how do you define your success metrics, and then how do you evaluate that more technically speaking?
Right. So for right now, because the exact definition of cohesion is contested. It's contested in the academic literature. It would be even more contested internally, or is more contested internally. Our optimization objective right now is engagement. That if we can encourage more Canadians to spend more time with us and to engage with more SKUs across more voices and a broader, diverse set of content, we believe that we're winning. So that's currently what we're training on, but the real inter-session, membership-oriented user citizen of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, we want to ultimately be able to see how well they're cohesing with the rest of society overall. But right now, admittedly, it's narrowly on engagement.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. So have you ever considered some macro-level metrics, or even some sort of direct surveys with people? Like we've seen in the first tutorial about this, using combined methods to measure the success, so including direct surveys with people. Are they really more open or cohesive as a result of maybe being exposed to CBC?
Absolutely. And no, they're both fine companies. CBS is a lot of fun. They are. I like Star Trek. One of the things that was unique about the 2000s was that we had 5 federal elections that resulted in a massive survey going out. And what's great about the Canadian election study is that everybody sees it, and that everybody sees that battery over the course of those 5 years. Now, maybe next year, there might be a minority government which would kick off a whole bunch more of those surveys that are going. So that kind of information I'd like to see be more public as opposed to a private KPI that's specific to the CBC and that doesn't get reported out. So part of the motivation for going towards, for talking to you all today about feeling thermometers is that at least they are generalizable across multiple countries and multiple public broadcasters, so that way we can see things comparatively and longitudinally overall. But 100%, the survey method, because it's anonymous, enables a better, I hope, better accuracy on the ground.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
One more.
Greg from Meet Mindful. Love the presentation. It was a question inspired by this gentleman. So the conversation between both of you was that you can't rally a country to force society to live with uniform views.
In Canada, because it's too big.
Right.
Yeah.
In that context, there are certain things that have come to light, things like Bill C-16 maybe being one of the more relevant ones. The question being is that can social cohesion still happen when the law gets involved in that to that degree?
It's not something that a public broadcaster like. We're a crown corporation, so we're a creature of the federal government and serving on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen. So we don't write that legislation. So one way or another, like just as we don't create the geography, we're just going to keep on trying to unite the country as best as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Right on. Thank you, eh?
Yeah. So everyone give a big round of applause for Christopher.
Thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.